Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your hosts, Chris Jennings and Dr. Mike Brasher.
Once again, joined with my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher, and we have kind of a fun conversation today, and it's a fun and also an educational conversation, especially for spring and summer months. What we're talking about today is really it's urban nesting mallards, more or less, and also some Canada geese too. But what the issue is we get tons of phone calls and emails, especially I get them coming in through the website, and it's all about, what do I do with this duck? I have a duck nesting in my flower pot. You know, what's the next step? And I wanted to get Mike on here and really bring to light some of the science of it. You know, what's going on in this process, but also, what do you do? What do you do when you have a duck in your pool and it won't leave? Like, what's that duck preparing to do? So, Mike, you know, that's one thing we've kind of laughed about it and talked about it quite a bit, but what does someone do? What's the first thing that they do when they find this random mallard nest in their bushes or in their flower pot?
Let me just say, Chris, this was one of the first things I realized whenever I actually moved into the position I currently have now at headquarters, is that these calls come in quite often. You know, you can almost set your calendar to the timing of these calls when they start coming in. It's obviously, you know, spring when the ducks start nesting. We're here in Memphis, and so yeah, whenever spring rolls around, you know these calls are going to start coming in. In my previous position, I really didn't get any of these calls. I just wasn't in that type of position to really get them. But it's kind of neat, really is, because when you think about the way people intersect with waterfowl for a lot of society, this is it. You know, we had Ben O'Neill on an episode early on, and he spoke about that very thing, and that it's a lot of times we in the profession take these birds for advantage, take them for granted, the urban nesting ducks and geese. But the reality is, those are the components of the waterfowl population that most people have some interaction with. So naturally, they get these questions, and they call Ducks Unlimited quite often. And sometimes you get those questions. Sometimes they come to me. And so as you laid out there, the most basic question is, all right, hey, I've got this. We get a phone call, and we call them, and then they say, I've got this duck that's nesting. It's chosen to nest in my flower pot. What do I do? Well, the reality is that bird is recognized as a migratory species. So that's kind of the first thing that we have to lay out here, is there are certain pieces of legislation that dictate what you can and cannot do with that bird. Despite it being in an urban setting, it is technically recognized as a migratory bird. So what comes into play there is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, so which states that you cannot harm, harass, take, kill outside of any other outside of the allowed regulations, these migratory birds. And it does not allow for just kind of blanket removal of a duck or a duck's nest or eggs, or I should say, the duck or its eggs or ducklings. You have to have a permit to do that if you can. So that's one of the first things that I tried to do when I started getting these calls. I would call around and try to see if there was somebody in the area, like any of these animal control businesses, that would take care of these situations, if they would have the federal permits that would allow them to remove the hen and her eggs. And there's not, and none that I have really found have the permits here in Memphis to do that, because I guess there's a lot of paperwork involved when you're talking about a federal permit. So technically, with that kind of background, you can't just legally go in and remove the eggs of that hen without kind of running afoul of a law that's on the books. So, once you have that hen and she has a nest with eggs in it, technically you got to let her, you have to let her run the course of that nesting attempt. Now, the good news is that once she hatches, those ducklings are gonna going to go on, they're going to leave. So if you can just, live with that duck. A lot of folks call and they're concerned about the duck because they have a dog and they're afraid the dog is going to harass the duck or capture the duck or whatever. And in those cases, I say, well, if you're that, if you want to protect the hen, then you will need to kind of keep your dog away from it, or your cat may be the case from it. Otherwise, you can kind of just let nature take its course, so to speak. But a lot of folks call because they're concerned about it and they care for the duck and they want to protect it. So, there's a couple of things that you have to consider there. Is number one, you can't just go in and start removing it. And then if you wanted to work around your daily activities, you can do so. And the incubation period for these ducks is about 28 days on average. And then once those eggs hatch, those little ducklings are gonna scurry off. So that's sort of the basic line that I give folks, is that if you can live with it, then I'd encourage you to do so. There aren't a lot of options available to you, within the legal framework, at least not here in Memphis. There may be some other places around the country that have some animal control operations that have those permits. And so that's one of the things that you can do is get in touch, go through the, I guess I was going to say the yellow pages, but who knows what the yellow pages is anymore. You can Google for animal control company in your area. You can also, and I've tried this as well, you can also get in touch with your state game agency, natural resource agency, or if you have a Fish and Wildlife Service office in the city where you live or nearby where you live, you can call them also. Now, obviously, Ducks Unlimited, we don't have any of those permits. We don't do that kind of stuff. But you can call some of those folks. Now, what I will back up here, Chris, and I will say, if people see a hen, a mallard kind of hanging around prospecting for a nest site, at that time they can try to scare. If they see where that hen is kind of investigating, they can put something up that would prevent the hen from getting there. They can harass the hen as she's, to try to scare her away to prevent her from nesting in those locations. But yeah, once she starts laying those eggs, then technically your options are limited.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too. When you see the hen begin, and a lot of people will see this early on, or the early stages of this, and even call in, which is interesting because they're seeing mating rituals, and they're seeing, different mating flights, and they're like, these ducks are, flying around my house. That's crazy. I don't know what to do. And that's kind of those first steps. And that's kind of where I lead people, like, hey, just, keep your eye out. If you see a nest, you don't want to. But another thing to point out to people, that are confused as the reason, like, those birds are not counted in surveys. In overall waterfowl surveys, breeding population surveys. And I think that's something that's a little confusing to people. But one reason for that, and I know Dale Humberg, our former chief scientist, he would always point out that the success rate of these kind of urban breeding birds is really low. Because not only do they have the same issues that wild birds are facing on the prairies, but they also have a lot of domestic cats. They have, dogs, these people walking along are disturbing the nest unintentionally. But they have a lot of issues too. So that nest success is fairly limited. So can you kind of talk about that? Like, that's something that people need to know, especially when they're sitting there and they're like, hey, this duck has been on the nest for, over 30 days. What's going on? The odds are she's probably getting ready to abandon that nest because something has either got it or they find eggs after 2 or 3 days that are busted up and something happened. That's something that people need to be aware of.
That's right, Chris. With some of the stories that we hear from people that call in, about the only response I can give people sometimes is, well, we're dealing with urban ducks here. And sometimes these urban ducks and urban geese also, we kind of have to remember to talk about them as well. But maybe the urban geese are a bit more predictable, I think. Some of the stories about urban mallards, especially in high concentrations, they're a bit different. And about the only thing I can say with respect to some of the things that people see and some of their comments about these ducks is that, they're kind of weird. They kind of do some weird stuff sometimes because they're in these in some places, artificially high concentrations, artificially high densities. And you see some weird social things. There may be some instances where I don't know the statistics on this. I don't know what average viability and nest success rates of urban nesting mallards is, but my suspicion would be that the viability of the net of the eggs of these ducks is probably lower than those in wild free ranging mallards. Again, I don't know that to be factual, but it wouldn't surprise me to be the case. I'm sure that information's out there. I'm just not immediately familiar with it. So yeah, you kind of have to keep that in mind as well. These ducks are just a little unusual. Now, to your point about them not being surveyed, that is correct. But one of the interesting things that Ben O'Neill was sharing with us last year on an earlier episode is that they're studying some of these urban nesting mallards, and they're finding some of those birds, a fair percentage of those birds actually making it into the harvest of hunters, which is a really interesting thing in itself. And I know some other state agencies are starting to invest resources, research, science resources into urban nesting mallards. I think the state of Michigan is going to be either going to be launching a study, or maybe they've already initiated it. Where part of the work involves studying the breeding ecology of urban nesting mallards. They've been around for decades, but they're starting to, interestingly enough, kind of return to the science and research scene where we're realizing, hey, maybe they don't just hang out in the city like we always thought they did. So they do give us some really interesting questions to try to answer. And as we're learning, it has some relevance to hunters. Now, in terms of our ability to survey those populations, that's a challenge that remains to be addressed, and so that's I'm interested to see what the agencies figure out in terms of the ability to do that.
You kind of alluded to my next topic a little bit as far as Canada geese, and it ends up these urban nesting Canada geese. For me personally, I honestly cannot get enough of those videos on like Instagram where this Canada goose is just wrecking this businessman who's walking down the sidewalk. Like, they're just hilarious. And they don't know what to do. And that's another point that kind of why we wanted to do this podcast here is, what do you do when you have, what does a business do? I mean, we get phone calls all the time. Hey, we have a Canada goose that's nesting right outside of our door. What can we do? And this thing is, and what are they doing? What is a Canada goose doing when it is chasing a human down the sidewalk? Like, what are they actually doing?
Well, they're saying, get the heck out of here.
That's right. They're just protecting the nest. And that's what, I think a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, these geese are so mean. And, and that's not necessarily the case, other than they do get pretty angry. But these waterfowl have these, I've seen videos, and you've probably seen it as well, where Canada geese are chasing away predators.
Yeah.
In the prairies or in the boreal, but it's the same exact process. And I think that's what people need to understand.
That's right.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
We have to, again, here we go back to an earlier conversation we had about the mating systems of waterfowl. Geese and swans and whistling ducks and a few other species of ducks, but for the most part, we're just talking geese and swans here. Mate for life, or at least mate until one of the pair members dies. And so that they're able to do that partly just because they are such large-bodied birds. There is value in both members of that pair remaining near the nest site. They are large enough that the male can actually help defend the female and the nest and the eggs while in that nesting process. You think about ducks. A male duck can't really fend off a predator worth anything, so that kind of has helped shape the differences in the mating systems. And so, me mentioning kind of swans in passing also reminds me that they too, especially when we talk about mute swans, and I think trumpeter swans in some locations, we're starting to see this as well. Yes, they can be aggressive towards humans, but as you said, what they are doing is they are defending their female, they are defending that nest, they are defending those eggs, and then they'll also defend those goslings or the cygnets, the young swans, once they hatch. And of course, the larger a bird is, the more physically intimidating and, quite frankly, dangerous it is for people that try to approach these birds. So, in addition to when we're talking about geese and swans, in addition to any kind of legal ramifications for kind of messing with the birds, you got to think about those birds' ability to actually physically harm you. And you do see that on occasion. And in some cases, most of the times it's, people are running away, being chased away, and they trip and fall and that type of stuff. But when they come at you with those wings, the bones in those wings are very powerful and very stout, and you will feel it if they hit you with it. So, just people need to be mindful that when they see geese or swans acting aggressively towards them, give them wide berth, because they're trying to defend themselves, but then they will inflict a bit of harm on you if it comes to that, if they need to. Now, because Canada geese we've all seen in large concentrations of Canada geese, their droppings can create a mess and can create some unsanitary conditions, and maybe in some cases some health hazards. So there are more options available to people for that type of nuisance goose control, and a lot of states have programs in place where they allow people, or they facilitate the removal of those birds, the removal or relocation of those birds. So folks might have better success getting assistance with management of problem Canada geese or swans than they would with ducks, possibly because of those other factors there, the sanitation concerns, as well as the just the physical harm. And but the other thing that you can do for Canada geese, and this is what people like to really preach, our managers like to preach to people that perennially every year have problems with Canada geese, is like, try to make whatever it is that whatever your space is that they are using, whether it be a golf course, whether it be the front lawn of your office complex or your apartment complex. A lot of times we see these new neighborhoods where they've constructed this pond, and then surrounding it are all these housing units, and then that pond it goes from water to immediately to an abrupt change to the shoreline, which is neatly groomed grass. Well, Canada geese are grazers, and so what is the habitat that they are looking for when it comes to foraging? It's this neatly manicured, young, lush grass that you're actually providing for them. So one way that you can make your area, one way that you can kind of help mitigate the effect of these the problems caused by Canada geese, is to make your area, your backyard or your community recreational space, less attractive to Canada geese. And I realize we also like that lush green grass, because that's a great place for us to play. But even I think I've seen in many places, they'll encourage people to allow the grass at the very edge of the wetland to grow up. And so it makes it a little more difficult and perhaps discourages the Canada geese from coming to the edge of the pond and just walking right up out onto the grass. Now, I don't know how effective that is, but you can start to use an understanding of the ecology of the species to help you manage your property, your space, in a way that's less attractive to Canada geese, to discourage their establishment in that location anyway. So it's another another alternative that we have for that species.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've even seen people who have put out like coyote decoys to kind of deter the Canada geese from walking up in their yards and moving in on that. And I don't know how effective that is, but it's certainly something that someone can try, as which, we've both kind of alluded to that it is. The issue with this is for everyone to understand it is illegal to harass these nests and these nesting birds. These are federally protected birds, but there are options out there and in certain agencies to contact. But no, I think this is something that we get. Like I said, we get the phone calls all the time. It's good for us to talk about this. It's good for us to approach it. Although, what we need our audience to understand is that is not what Ducks Unlimited does. Ducks Unlimited does not go out and clear mallards from a local pool or someone's flower pot. But it is, like you mentioned, it's something that this may be the only interaction that someone has with waterfowl. And we need to be able to educate that and provide the information about these birds, because I think that's a very important thing.
That's right. And the other thing that I try to leave people with is the realization that this nesting activity is limited in time. They're not going to be there year round, So if they've established the nest, give them their space and just try to coexist with them. And the nesting period will last 4 or 5 weeks at the most, or at least for an individual nest attempt. And so let's say there's about an average of 9 eggs laid. They'll lay 1 egg per day, and then they will incubate that nest or those eggs for about 28 days. So you're looking at about 37 days there. Yeah, it's not the entire summer. Once they hatch, they're off to somewhere else. Now, what you can do is after that nest hatches, or if it's destroyed or something, then take measures at that point to prevent the hen from coming back and nesting in that same location. We grow our vegetable gardens, and we have to contend with all sorts of insects, and some folks try to use non-chemical means, and so you're trying to figure out how to fend off these nuisance pests from eating your vegetables. And so it's kind of the same type of thinking with regard to ducks and geese that may be nesting in proximity to you. Try to understand what they're doing and figure out ways to prevent them from doing that, or make those areas less attractive. So that's the key message I always try to leave people with, that this is temporary. So rather than seeing them necessarily as a problem in all cases, see if you can kind of learn something from them. And a lot of folks do that. They actually take pride in kind of caring for the ducks whenever they're nesting. They just want to know what they need to do. And so I will tell you that I have one of the more interesting stories, and I'll get you to share one of the more interesting stories that you've had. There, if you have one of those. Last year, I received a call from a lady who talked a lot about nesting, and here I'm telling folks that once those eggs hatch, the ducklings are off to somewhere else. Well, what this lady called me to talk about was the fact that, okay, so the hen had hatched these eggs, and she had a brood of ducklings, but the ducklings had taken up shop in her pool. And so she said, I try to get them out, but then they go right back in there. And then the next thing I know, they actually get caught in the filter. You know how there's that filter that captures or trash collecting thing. I don't know exactly what it's called. We don't have a pool, but the ducklings would get in there, and I think she would take the top off of it, and they would be able to jump out of there. But it was just like a revolving door. She would get them out and then go back in. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. If you have a dog, you can kind of let the dog out there and maybe keep the dog on a leash, and maybe it will scare the hen away and she'll realize this isn't a place to keep the ducklings. But basically that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to match wits with the ducklings and the hen at that point, and trying to make that pool less attractive, trying to send a message that, hey, this is not a safe place for you. You need to go somewhere else at that point. So Chris, what about you? What's one of the weirdest calls you've received?
We've received all kinds of weird calls from golf courses too. Like I said, a Canada goose is set up at a local business right at the front door, and it's attacking everyone who walks in, and that becomes a problem. But, just personally, I have a pool and we open it usually middle to late April. We'll open the pool, and my 10-year-old black lab, she's getting older, getting a little slower, and she's not the most active dog, especially in the early morning when it's not duck season. And so we let her out in the morning, and she usually just kind of saunters out in the backyard and does this. But, I'll honestly just open the back door and let her out and not be paying attention. And last year in the spring, I opened the door and she almost like took my legs out from under me because she was going so fast, and she leapt and jumped into the pool. It was only like half full, and these two mallards come flying straight up, and we never saw them come in. We know, we didn't know that they were in there, obviously, but they never came back. So once that happens, it's kind of a good deterrent for sure. The dog chases them out, but she didn't know any different. She was rearing to get a mallard in her mouth in April and didn't know the difference. But yeah, there's lots of these stories, and I think that's a good thing for people to understand. I'm glad that we had this conversation. I'm glad we brought this to light. We do have a page on our website that's called Ducks Nesting in Your Backyard. It's a highly popular visit, throughout the spring and early summer. It gets a lot of traffic, but it'll explain to listeners or to visitors to the site, what to look for in the nest, what the nest looks like as far as like a mallard nest or a Canada goose nest, how long that bird's going to sit on the nest. It really goes through what you just explained, the whole process. It also highly encourages people to not mess with the nests.
Yes.
It is against the law to contact state and fish and wildlife agencies if possible. But yeah, I think what we've got, we've provided as much information, I think, as we can about these birds right now. But I think one thing we need to look at is here soon, we're going to have to get Dr. Ben O'Neill back on and discuss these urban mallards who are now becoming a part, potentially, of the harvest. And that's that was one of our most popular shows in the last season. Yeah.
One last thing before we go, hearing you talk about this reminds me, if people have a mallard nesting in their backyard and it hatches and you see the hen leading the ducklings away, that's the most critical time to leave them alone. Let them do their thing. A lot of people say they kind of get worried when they see the hen see one or two of the ducklings get separated from the hen, and they want to try to rescue it and bring it back together with the hen. My advice is leave the hen and the duckling alone. Even if you see them separated, they, more times than not, will figure it out. The hen will call to the ducklings. She will try to get them to come back. Now, you see these stories online all the time about how ducklings falling into the sewer, and people call out the firemen or the policeman to try to rescue those. Those are probably outlier situations. More times than not, the hen and the ducklings are going to reunite and go on to wherever it is they're heading if you just leave them alone and try not to intervene. Nature has a way of figuring things out. Nature has a way of kind of taking care of itself, you might say. And sometimes the outcomes are great. Sometimes the outcomes are not so great. But that's always the safe thing, is just let, quote, nature take its course there. Let the hen and ducklings try to work things out and try not to interfere.
All right. Well, there you have it. That's the information that's needed. So now for all of our listeners out there who see someone post on their Nextdoor app or post online that, they're having an issue with a duck, feel free to either reference this podcast or send them to ducks.org and look up the ducks nesting in your backyard piece because it's a great source of information. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you joining me.
Absolutely, Chris. This was fun.
I'd like to thank my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher, for joining me today to talk about urban nesting ducks and geese and what to do with them. I'd like to thank our podcast producer, Clay Baird, who's doing a great job getting these things put together for us. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for listening and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks.